Okay, hello everyone. This is Keisha Rogers, and on the line with me today, I have the members of the LaRouche National Slate for the new presidency, and these representatives are from New Jersey. We have Diane Sayer. From Detroit, we have Bill Roberts. We have Dave Christie from Washington State, Rachel Brown from Massachusetts, and we have Summer Shields from San Francisco. And today's discussion with the slate is going to be refuting sectionalism in the new presidency. So with that, what I'd like to do first before we start our discussion is just let the listening audience know that the slate, our national campaign, is going to be hosting a series of these discussions. We hope to have these discussions available for you on a weekly basis that you can listen in and really get an understanding of what the foundation of our federal government, of our nation, represents, away from this conception and idea of looking out for one's own interest, the leadership, making deals or looking out for the interests of a small section of the population, but that our nation was founded on the principle of a unified idea of searching and identifying truth in the universe. And this means that what we are looking at in our federal government is what the principles of our Constitution, the commitment to the general welfare of all citizens, the commitment to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, has to be the defining principle for our nation. And if that is not the principle, if that's not the fight that the leadership, members of Congress, the Senate, House of Representatives, and the presidency, for the most part, most importantly, is fighting for, then they are going against the interest of the nation. If they're looking out for the interest of their own local interests, then this is what we're going to define today as sectionalism, which is against every principle in which the union of our nation represents. So before we get into some of that discussion, then what I wanted to do first is to have Diane start off with a brief overview and introduction on what we're faced with right now and what the strategic political situation is defining for us.
Hi. So basically, as people know who've been on the website, we are on the brink of a thermonuclear war, a thermonuclear world war. And the backdrop to this is the bankruptcy, the total utter bankruptcy of the transatlantic financial and economic system. People are familiar with some of the disaster level conditions in the United States, the devastating extreme weather conditions, foreboding food shortages next spring, and you also have now a collapse of the entire Eurozone. There's a total panic, and I was actually struck because we got a report this morning from Helga LaRouche, who is in Europe at the moment, describing how they're trotting out all of these former and current leaders in Germany, Helmut Schmidt, Helmut Kohl, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, and all of them are saying, oh, it's a terrible disaster. We cannot allow the euro to fail. We have to do everything necessary to bail out the euro, to save the euro. And it really reminded me of the line we heard from Hank Paulson when the bailouts first began under the Bush administration with the assistance of people like Barney Frank, Frank Dodd Pelosi, et cetera, and Obama, saying, oh, if we don't bail out Wall Street, we're going to have to impose martial law. So you have a similar kind of hysteria being pushed in the European news media about how this thing cannot be allowed to fail. And you have governments collapsing like Italy, Slovakia, Greece. In the case of Italy, the new head of state literally is a board advisor of Goldman Sachs. And they are demanding now such vicious austerity that people can go on YouTube. There's a video of the welfare minister named Elsa Fornero, who is speaking about the need for the brutal austerity measures in the country, and she started crying when she got to the word sacrifice. And Monty, the new Goldman Sachs would-be dictator, steps in and says, she meant to say sacrifice, and he starts laughing. So it's the most brutal crushing of the population. So you have that as the backdrop, and then you have a full press drive run out of London, as the previous wars were run out of London, that is putting the United States on a collision course with Russia and China. So the media says, well, it's Syria, it's Iran. Those countries are incidental. The idea is to destroy civilization, and the Russians are aware of this, which they have made very clear. And with Mr. LaRouche's hammering away at high-level military and other institutional figures who are part of the U.S. presidency, we were able to expose that the British were planning to do this and jam it up. So their timing has been somewhat delayed, and now what they're trying to do is to use Turkey, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, to use other nations to get the war going. And what you have is a horrific crisis of leadership. Mr. LaRouche was emphasizing earlier today that unfortunately, there are not many Americans in quote-unquote leadership who are demonstrating the qualities that are necessary for us to survive. You have a handful of people in the military who get it, who have been outspoken, but you have people like Joe Biden, who we know is not nearly as insane as Miro Obama, our president, but he goes over to Turkey, tells them they want a buffer zone, and says publicly that we're going to overthrow Assad in Syria. I mean, this is insane. Or you have our Secretary of State now criticizing the Russian elections, and to weaken the Russian government, which is right now one of the few sane voices in the world against World War III, is just very much in the interest of mankind. So the point is, you know, you can say, well, these people are clearly under massive, massive pressure. Obama is nuts. He's running a dictatorship. He's pressuring people. But when civilization is on the line, you cannot condone people caving in, because it means that we head for World War III. So it's clear that this question of leadership, I mean, that's really what LaRouche has put on the table for us, but that's the backdrop for the discussion that we're about to have tonight.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And I just want to expound and have more discussion on just what you brought up now, Diane, on the crisis of leadership, because I think that is the defining principle of this discussion. When you look at what we're faced with right now, it's a real crisis in leadership, especially when you're looking at what is governing this process of elections for the presidential elections. And when you see what we have coming out of both parties is total insanity, from the standpoint that there's a rejection to, or just non-recognition of the reality that's facing the nation and facing the entire planet at this moment in history, where you look at these presidential elections for the Republican slate, and you have no competency of leadership whatsoever in the presidency. Every one of these presidential candidates is really committed to their own interest or to their sectional interest of how they're going to make certain deals, and not looking at this from a top-down approach. Or if you look at the Democrats, I mean, how is it, and people should most definitely, chime in on this. I'm, thinking, how is it that you can have the Democratic Party, who is still defending this president who has shown a utter, disregard for human life and is, committed to the drive of thermonuclear warfare and is very blatant about it. And we have been out there on the grounds, and we can talk about this, exposing the threat that Obama represents as a real narcissistic personality, as a carbon copy of the Emperor Nero that Mr. LaRouche very correctly described in his April 2009 webcast. And so, I think that this question of the crisis in leadership is what is really something that has to be defined, but also what we represent as a slate. As I said, we're defining the new presidency, which really takes this on as the alternative to what we're seeing in the leadership.
Keisha, I'd throw in the issue of Lynn's role within the institution of the presidency, which has been one of absolute central leadership ever since he put the Strategic Defense Initiative on the table, and even before that, before blowing the plan for World War III out back in the late 70s under the Carter administration. Brzezinski and others were pushing for a first strike against the Soviet Union back then. And coming out of that expose, where LaRouche used his presidential bid to shut down that war drive, he developed the Strategic Defense Initiative, which Ronald Reagan adopted. They had some discussions at a presidential debate, and this has now been put on the table. What LaRouche had outlined then is that you cannot have war amongst the major nations. It immediately goes thermonuclear. It means the extinction and end of civilization as we know it. And what LaRouche had said is, okay, well, what are we going to do about that? And developed the Strategic Defense Initiative, which would have made nuclear warfare obsolete by developing space-based weapon systems that would have been able to neutralize these weapons, right? Now, the Russians have put that back on the table with the Strategic Defense of the Earth, which is a direct call to LaRouche's policy. And I think it's very clear that them putting that policy on the table and the question of Arctic development on the table is that they see Lynn as a central leadership within the world of those patriots of whatever nation they may be a part of who are rallying to stop this war and to stop this British imperial policy, which is collapsing. It's obvious. The whole Eurozone is melting down. The Federal Reserve is committed to another hyperinflationary bailout of the European banking system. This is just insane beyond belief. And we have a lot of very confused Americans. I could also say idiotic Americans who are the ones beating their chest at Russia and China, saying that they're the problem when they're the ones putting the only policy that's going to save their own can on the table, which is LaRouche's SDE. And I just make a quick point here, which is that LaRouche has talked about this, but there's no room for nuclear war on this planet, and therefore there's going to have to be a shift of the military back to a tradition that is, what the Strategic Defense of the Earth from the Russians does say is that we not only face the threat of nuclear war on this planet, but we face dangers coming from space, from this giant asteroid that that passed between the Earth and the Moon. These are going to be increasingly more common, and we can't rely on the lottery to get us safely through the generations here. We have to develop the capability of destroying these things and, frankly, shifting gears within the military towards that kind of defense. since there's no need for defense against nuclear warfare because you can't defend against it. It's just so anyway. So now shifting the military back to that tradition of more of an engineering and scientific capability, that is the tradition of the West Point tradition, right? It's the American intellectual tradition that we've gotten away from that. In fact, if you look at what the military has become with this privatized mercenary operations where you just have a bunch of trained thugs that get paid by the imperial crowd to fight their wars. But the West Point tradition, you know, a graduate used to be required to have 3 semesters of physics, a course in electrical engineering, and that tradition went back to Sylvanus Thayer, who was a key architect of the West Point policy, where he worked directly with the leadership of the École Polytechnique in France, one of the key scientific institutions of Europe that has produced some of the greatest minds, right? But that is our tradition, and the American population, unfortunately, has went along with the British policy of getting stupider, more stupid as they go, and allowed their culture to be eroded. When if they just look at their history, that is their history, and they should. So that's the point. We have no more room for nuclear war. We should shift the policy of the military towards the strategic defense of the earth policy, and go back to where creativity is the strategic policy, because we face threats that we have yet to encounter, and we're going to need people that can actually think and develop the solutions to the problems that mankind faces from space and beyond. And the American population will be much happier with the revival of the American intellectual tradition.
Yes, absolutely. And if we really define this, getting back to this point of the absence and the crisis in leadership, you know, if you're thinking about what Diane and Dave just laid out here of the strategic threat, the real threat that is being posed to the existence of mankind, we have to actually really get at the underlying axiomatic conception of what it is that people are, what it is that the population is running from. What is the leadership running from? What is it that has allowed us to get to the point where we refuse, you know, the population has the majority. So why is it that you don't have an uprising in the population to throw this president out? And I think that, you know, if Dave or Bill, rather, may have something to say on this matter from the standpoint of the leadership that capitulates to popular opinion. And LaRouche had some comments on this just the other day with the slate, is that real leadership does not conform to popular opinion. It actually functions on a principle of truth. And I think that we've gone away from that. You look at some of the labor unions, and you look at the leadership in Congress, and people are now saying we have to defend Obama. We have to, you know, elections are coming up. We can't look bad for elections. We have to look out for our own personal interests. And this is something that's very not just destructive to these various institutions, but destructive to the nation as a whole. And people have to start taking responsibility for the consequences of their action. So, Bill, would you go through just a little bit of, you know, what is it that's shaping some of the thinking coming out of some of these institutions? I know you had some things to say about the labor unions.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there is absolutely a real crisis in leadership that follows exactly with what we're talking about in terms of this plague of sectionalism, of partisanism. Actually, what Dave was bringing up about the military reminded me that the role of the labor unions has used to be, if we think back to the role of Walter Reuther, one of the first UAW presidents, you know, he was the head of a major union the United Auto Workers, but he was also the author of a strategic war-fighting policy for World War II, which actually mobilized the productive capabilities of the nation, and then in the to retool auto and to build actually the numbers of planes and weapons and materiel that were required to defeat the Nazis, and also other policies that he had proposed after the war, which were policies that were in the national interest. And you can see just how little politics have gotten, and how this sectionalism problem really does tend to divide the country and cause a situation where, for example, this past year, when you had a number of right-wing, Tea Party-backed governors and legislatures take over the legislature in a number of states in the Midwest, immediately they started pushing anti-union bills, bills against teachers' unions, against collective bargaining, just generally bills that were attacks on labor. Now, the labor unions immediately went into a response against that, which I can't blame them for, defending labor unions. But they got so into the fight of recalling these governors, recalling other people, fighting against these policies, recalling these policies. But they backed down on actually the fight that was really closer to solving the problem of the overall problem that we face as a country, which is that we've got this president who is controlled by London and Wall Street and is wrecking the economy, and also the fight they have largely backed down on the fight for Glass-Steagall, which is the only policy that really addresses the international nature of this crisis. Because, this is the economic crisis is a crisis of a hyperinflationary blowout of the financial system, and the pressures that come on government to cut the budgets, and a real collapse of the physical economy, which is completely systemic. And so you can really see the nature of how this sectionalism works, and the corrupting influence that making deals and taking the easier route and fighting the fight that seems to be kind of in the narrow, short-term self-interest of the party, or that which causes the least conflict, gets us to a situation where we're on the verge of World War III. And this is definitely something that Kennedy talked about in his book, The Profiles in Courage, where he talked about how difficult and how rare it was that you actually have had representatives in the Senate who have actually fought for a principle, who have actually fought for a principle of the nation, instead of just trying to appease their local constituency or appease public opinion in a narrower sense. And I think that's definitely a large part of what we're seeing right now, besides just cowardice.
Absolutely. And just on this question of going against the grain of popular opinion, and what you just brought up from the standpoint of Kennedy. Kennedy was John F. Kennedy and his brother Bobby, but more particularly President Kennedy, were really representing a threat to the enemy of the nation, and they were going against popular opinion. And I think that the listening audience really wants to get an idea of where this leadership, where this courage can be found again. And if they have been paying attention to what our national slate is representing and what we've done throughout this campaign, when we started with the slate being 3 members, which were myself running here in Texas, Rachel in Massachusetts, and Summer, that we led the charge during that campaign in 2010 to remove Obama, fully fund NASA, stop the Wall Street bailouts, a strong campaign which is absolutely essential now if we're going to deal with the collapse of the system, to drive towards hyperinflation, to get Glass-Steagall, Franklin Roosevelt's Glass-Steagall policy. And really what we represent are the principles that define what the Democratic Party is from the standpoint of a commitment of the ideas of President John F. Kennedy and President Franklin Roosevelt, because these were 2 courageous leaders of our nation. And so I'll just ask Rachel, because I know, speaking of courageousness and speaking of the courage which is required when you ran your campaign and you took on Barney Frank. Now, that was something that shook the entire nation, and it didn't just show that you were running in a local district for Congress, but it showed national leadership. And so Barney Frank just announced that he's going to be retiring and that he's not going to run again, so you've shook him up a bit. And I just wanted to, from the standpoint of what this new presidency and national slate represents, why is this significant, and what do you see as, going to be the turning point for really getting the population to now just take off the gloves and really fight?
Yeah, well, I think that one thing that the retirement of Barney Frank represents is the power of an idea, of a seemingly relatively weak force, which represents something that's truthful. And I mean, Barney Frank was one of the worst people in Congress representing Wall Street, and he retired because he couldn't handle the heat of, 1, the financial collapse, and 2, the fact that the LaRouche movement had his number. So 1 is what happened to Barney Frank, I think, is what needs to happen to Obama now. And we have led this fight for the removal of Obama. The only thing stopping it is maybe just a few people's disbelief of the fact that a small group can change history. But we've seen this before. We saw it with the resignation of Nixon, and the removal of Obama has to happen immediately. So one message I have for other candidates who are running for office right now is that unless you're speaking about the removal of Obama and the threat of thermonuclear war, you're not representing your constituency. And the LaRouche slate is going to go out with this message to the entire nation, and this is the only relevant issue. There's really no other relevant issues to discuss other than the immediate removal of Obama and the threat of thermonuclear war.
I just want to, because it's good, absolutely, to challenge the other candidates. I think we also all would like to challenge the American people, because it really is absurd, and we've seen this in past elections where you can't really tell if it's an election or a bad opera or something off Broadway or what exactly it is with this slate of candidates that they're trotting up in front of us. And the idea that somehow Newt Gingrich is some kind of statesman or something when he tried to shut down the government under Clinton, and with his own history of infidelity and everything else. I mean, one, it's a testament to perhaps to how really horrible Obama is, but it also, for anyone to be even thinking about this when the next president wouldn't be in place until January of 2013, and we're looking at whether the euro is going to make it till the end of the year and whether thermonuclear war is going to be launched, I don't know, next week. So anyway, Rachel, what you're saying to these is absolutely right, and the American population also has to have a higher standard.
And if I could say something on that, what you're bringing up here, just the fact that the people have allowed for what is really amounts to an insane President Obama. I think we can't say enough here that Obama has to be removed, and that, as you were bringing up, Keisha, there's more of us than there are of them. And for people to put up with an insane president, and he is a shame. And it's a shame for the people who founded this nation and the tradition that they represent and wanted to put in place. But I think it is safe to say he is nuts. He says things without knowing or understanding or even really caring what the consequences of what he's saying are. And that really makes him a perfect puppet to the real enemy, which is the enemy that has plagued our nation for a very long time. And this has been discussed on this website, as people have seen, as the oligarchical principle. And as Diane was going through in the opening of this thing, that this policy that we're seeing destroying the United States, this thing does come from London. And that the real problem that we have in trying to get this across to the average American person is that they don't understand the oligarchical principle, which wants to destroy the human being, is a totally against human progress. It's taken down why they have a guy like Obama who's taken down the space program, why we're destroying our industrial capacity for the last 40 years. The Midwest has been turned from the industrial belt to the Rust Belt. They don't understand why you have an oligarchical principle that would want to destroy the fruits of creativity and human progress, because they really don't understand what the human mind really represents. And I think just going back to this fight around the Strategic Defense Initiative that Lyndon LaRouche fought for and that Reagan introduced in the early 80s, that this was a total revolution. It was a fight around exactly what this conception of man is, because had we outsmarted these intercontinental ballistic missiles, these nuclear warheads, with a laser beam system, we at least would have had two things that would have happened. One is we would have avoided the threat right now. Had in the early 1980s, had the Soviet Union not rejected the Strategic Defense Initiative, we would have had we would have no threat today of a potential thermonuclear war, and we wouldn't have had perhaps any of the wars that took place since the early 1980s. And secondly, we would have had a situation where we could have truly freed the listener, the population out there. We could have truly freed you from the destructive effects of popular opinion, which is everyone goes along to get along, and then like the fabled lemmings, you end up dead. And that's something that we're absolutely fighting to present. We've uniquely, as a candidate slate, taken up the fight to get rid of Obama, and we've taken it up for 2.5 years, along with Mr. LaRouche and the LaRouche Political Action Committee. And I think it's ironic today, as Dave was bringing up earlier, that when the Soviet Union rejected the U.S. proffer for the SDI then in the 1980s, today the Russians have proposed the exact same policy, just to reiterate this, and the American people under a crazy President Obama are now going to allow us to reject that exact same proffer, which is being put forward. And it's not even just that it would be a defense to nuclear bombs or something like that, but the reverberating effects would be incredible. And we saw this with the Apollo mission, the kind of repercussions, what they call the spin-off or the spillover effect of the technology from the program itself to the civilian economy would totally revolutionize the relationship that every American has to the world. It would be a technological leap like mankind had never seen before, and it would thus actually end up in a situation where we would crush this oligarchical principle, the British Empire, once and for all. the they that people talk about when they say they can't be stopped, would have been crushed and can still be crushed. And the Russians, the reason why there's the people who do fall for the line that the Russians are bad or the Chinese are bad, the reason why they're falling for that line is because it's a propaganda campaign to get people to reject what could potentially destroy the oligarchy once and for all. And right now our movement is strategically intervening into a conference of the Geophysicists Union in San Francisco, where you have some of the top-of-the-line scientists, including many Russian scientists, and including a group of Russian scientists who are working on forecasting using technology that would be amplified under the strategic defense of Earth policy that's being put forward by the Russians now, to begin the process of forecasting earthquakes, so that you would never have to have a single life lost ever again to what we call natural disasters today, including we could have weather monitoring approaches that aren't just earthquakes, but we could begin to forecast things that would otherwise destroy human civilization, and we could begin to unleash the most beautiful future that mankind had ever seen. And this could be unleashed as early as tomorrow if the American people got up and decided to fight on behalf of their own well-being. And even at this proverbial, what they call it the 11th hour, the very last minute, we're looking at thermonuclear warfare any second. It could happen at any moment. We don't know. And as Diane just said, the euro is faced with disappearing before the end of this year. For anyone to be thinking about any one of these Republican candidates, or to be thinking that Obama will be out because of the election, is really not in reality. And I think that is definitely one of the points that we here are driving home to the people who are listening to this.
Yes, that is absolutely important. I think the principle behind what you're getting at and discussing here is really defined by our commitment as a slate and to building the future and everything that we represent from the standpoint of the fight to remove Obama, who's a threat to the existence of our nation and to a threat to the entire planet with this drive toward thermonuclear warfare, but also what we represent as the only alternative, the new presidency being defined by the principles of unifying the nation again, for that matter, unifying the planet, and the Strategic Defense Initiative, Strategic Defense Earth, the commitment to really taking on the challenges that are coming from the severe weather, the galactic threats to the planet, and nations coming together and acting in the interest of other nations, a new defined Treaty of Westphalia. We also see this with what we are doing with our organization and our slate, really championing the fight for the North American Water and Power Alliance. And I was bringing up this idea earlier that the North American Water and Power Alliance can be looked at as a real principle defying this idea of sectionalism, that this is a unifying principle for not just for the nation, but for the entire planet. And this is, you're talking about transforming the biosphere and bringing the entire planet into a harmonious ordering. And this is not just the planet, but when you think about expounding this into our investigation of the galaxy, these are the types of questions, these are the types of things that our nation should be investigating. Not just our nation, but the commitment to human progress must be developed around these questions. And these are the types of questions that are not being discussed by this bamboozling slate of Republican candidates for president. It's not being discussed by, Democrats who are trying to stay under Obama's coattail and capitulate to Obama. But it's only being discussed by our slate because, as you said, Summer, you really are taking up this question, and what people have to come to grapple with is what you're fighting against. What is the real enemy? And when you have an enemy that says that the commitment to human progress has to be destroyed, we have to depopulate the planet to less than 1 billion people, exterminating the human race through war, thermonuclear war policies. And this is not, people have to understand that this is the intention of the oligarchy. They despise the real commitment to human progress and human creativity. And so if you think about, for instance, when people are looking at the space program and they're saying, well, I guess, we lost that one. Maybe it wasn't meant to be. It cost too much going along with the budget line. Then they're not really understanding what we're being threatened with and what is the objective of this oligarchy and really this oligarchical principle to totally destroy the conception of the creative powers of the human mind. And what we represent and what mankind represent as a creative force in the universe is that, we can actually come to master these things that are threatening us, these galactic processes, these severe weather, or, some of these scientific challenges that we're facing. But if people don't have the courage to fight and they don't say that we're the majority, we're committed to our children, our grandchildren's future, if they don't free their minds, and this is the responsibility of leadership. Real leaders are going to take, in Congress, in the presidency, are going to take responsibility for the nation, for the outcome, for the well-being of its citizens. And when you are not in reality, as we've defined, most of these representatives, most of the members running for Congress are not in reality. We are facing the threat to the existence of mankind that is coming on now, and we have very little time to actually reverse that. So I think that is very important that we define for people and really challenge people at this higher identity of everything you are committed to in terms of, going along with popular opinion and your popular axioms and beliefs really have to be challenged. And most political discussions are not going to take this on. So I think this is very important.
Keisha, what you were bringing up with the space program, a lot of these arguments are the same things that you hear in environmentalism, which if you want to talk about sectionalism, that's what one of the biggest things, or, as a thought, is this environmentalism. Everything's this localized conception. Man is just some worm groveling in the dirt. And, there's no confusion in this of who runs environmentalism as a policy. It's the same British imperial networks that are pushing for thermonuclear World War III. They've stated it over and over. We have to reduce human population down to levels less than 2 billion, and recently coming out like what Attenborough had said at a recent speech, that we're going to go less than 1, right? So this is the oligarchical principle, and I think in the soul of the American is a hatred of the British Empire. It's the hatred of this oligarchism. Excuse me, a hatred of fascism, and I think one of the things they're just stuck in is this partisan nonsense. Well, if we get Obama out, we get the Republicans. Aren't they just as bad? And They just have to see that Obama is a puppet of this crowd. If we throw him out and rally to the, back to this American intellectual tradition where we say environmentalism is garbage. We need to move forward with space exploration, with the NWAPA program, and do what mankind is meant to do, which is to be creative. So I think we just the American people should recognize that it is in our souls to fight against this oligarchism.
Absolutely. And I think that we have most definitely issued a challenge and a clarion call to the American people. We've sounded the trumpets, and it's going to really require the population waking up and taking up the leadership and the courage that we're representing, and really not just getting behind our fight, but joining us on the front lines. So with that, I was just going to ask if there's any final comments from the candidates, because I think we can really wrap things up here, and we should take up more of this discussion in our next report that we will be doing on next week, and we'll tune people into when that will be taking place. So what do people have in terms of final comments? Maybe, Diane, you have something?
Well, actually, I was just looking at Shelley's poem because Lynn's comments on the why people tolerate this teensy little minuscule grouping of the oligarchy. And I was just caused to review Shelley's poem, The Mask of Anarchy, which people know. But the last stanza, which is totally relevant, I think people are familiar with. Rise like lions after slumber in unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few.
Absolutely. So it's time to rise, and this is what the American people must do. This is what the leadership must do. We have to once and for all shake off and refute any idea of sectionalism. Let's get back to the principles of the nation state, of the republic, of the unification of, everything that principle in which our nation represents. And so local interests, sectional interests are not a part of what we should be fighting for, but it should anybody who is representing the citizens of this nation have to be fighting for the interests of all citizens, of all members of this nation, and for that matter, for every nation across the planet, for the fighting for the well-being for all human beings. So that is what our fight is, and that is what people should be in the population should be fighting for, and we have very little time to do it because the situation right now is explosive. It's dire, and what Diane laid out at the beginning, that we have the entire transatlantic financial system on the verge of a meltdown, hyperinflation. We have a thermonuclear war policy that is threatening the entire existence of the human species. So if you understand this, then you better fight, and you better fight as though your life, your children's life, and your grandchildren's life, and everything you love dearly is being threatened, because it is. And this means you should get out there on the front lines with our slate of LaRouche Democrats for the new presidency and demand real leadership as we are providing that, and make sure that you are contributing and backing all of our slate. So with that, that will be the end of our discussion for today, and we will be talking with you next week. Thank you.